Hi, everyone. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane.
Welcome to the musical Innertube, the podcast born out of a mistake.
We once meant to introduce a soothing musical interlude, but we said soothing musical Innertube, and the name stuck.
On this podcast, we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, jobs, hobbies, and passions.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
When you meet a new person, it's usually the second or third question that's asked. And what do you do for a living? If movies have taught us anything, it's that life is wasted if you spend all of your time at work instead of with those you really love. Not to mention all those memes on social media encouraging you to take some me time. Usually the relationship between you and work winds up being all-encompassing, and most of the time you can bet your bosses don't always have your best interests in mind. Our guest today is Professor Elizabeth Anderson. She teaches at the University of Michigan, and she's made a career out of looking at equality in its various forms, including equality between the races, sexes, and workers and employers. She specializes in moral, social, and political philosophy and the philosophy of economics. She designed and was the first director of the program in philosophy, politics, and economics at Michigan, and her latest book is Hijacked: How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. Welcome to the Musical Innertube, Elizabeth Anderson.
It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
Let's talk about the Protestant work ethic, which is the main part of the thrust of your book. What is it, and why are we in such trouble because of it?
Well, the Protestant work ethic was an invention of Puritans in the 17th century in England. And most of the listeners probably know the Puritans as the killjoys of the 17th century. Right. So their ethic was an ethic of hard work, frugality, you have to say where you earn, chastity, temperance. It's a very ascetic doctrine. You shouldn't be consuming. You should be working hard and saving your money. Which is no luxury permitted.
Yeah, which is why, as an aside, it's so weird that Puritans are so linked to Thanksgiving and a big feast where you sit around and eat and don't do anything else, because they were far from that.
That's correct. But also, of course, notoriously in the Massachusetts colony, when they came over to America, they banned the celebration of Christmas.
Yeah, real sticklers on that.
The version of the work ethic that became neoliberalism, the idea that workers have a duty to endure tedious drudgery for the maximum profit of their employer.
It's interesting that it got the name neoliberalism. Because it doesn't sound very liberal on the face of it. And although one is used to hearing the term neoliberalism said, it is a rather pro-employer look at labor, and not necessarily pro-worker. And yet I think many of us work for folks where that's the culture when you step
Absolutely.
Inside the door.
So as far as liberalism goes, neoliberalism is coming from European uses of the term liberalism, which means pro-market, pro-capitalist, not American liberalism, which is associated with the New Deal and somewhat civil libertarian attitudes towards diverse lifestyles.
Now, the whole idea, I think, and this is tied in with things that we have heard over the years, like trickle-down economics and that sort of thing. The whole idea is that if you work hard and put your nose to the grindstone and your shoulder to the wheel and all the other good stuff, that you're going to make money for your employer, and your employer will reward you handsomely for doing that. He or she takes home the profits, and they will give you a fair wage for the work that you've done. And as most of us know, that's bullshit. That never happens. The profits go into other people's pockets, and you wind up wondering why you've done such excellent work for such meager pay. How did I guess, there is that thing in your head that work, as I said at the beginning of the show, work kind of defines who you are. How did that get into our very beings, and why can't we just push that aside and come up with something different?
I argue in Hijacked that the Puritans actually had somewhat contradictory ideas about work. So one idea is the tedious drudgery story for the maximum profit of the capitalist, your employer. And they also had an idea, which is that work is doing God's will on earth. And the purpose of work is to help our fellow human beings. That workers, when they follow through on God's commands for human beings on earth, they're doing honorable work. They're entitled to be honored for that work, even if they're doing menial labor. Even the street sweeper is entitled to be honored if they perform their work in a godly spirit. And they also had a very fairly enlightened business ethic. They told employers they had to pay fair wages, living wages, that they couldn't tyrannize over their workers, that if the workers were really, really poor, that they were entitled to charity, and that workers were entitled to safe working conditions and, a decent life. In addition, they argued that capitalists were wrong to adopt business models whereby they made a lot of money without helping other people, maybe exploiting them through monopolies. They condemned that wholesale. They condemned the slave trade. Not all of them, but the key theologians of the work ethic condemned the slave trade. So I think what we see is a kind of contradictory attitudes. On the one hand, it's nose to the grindstone, but on the other hand, workers are entitled to meaningful, decent conditions, meaningful work, and decent pay. And that tradition, I argue, ended up with, it was developed into social democracy. And so that's why across the social democracies of Europe, workers have guaranteed paid vacations.
Yes.
That's one of the glories of social democracy. In France, they get the month of August off. In Denmark, which I think is the champion of paid vacations, workers get 7 weeks off.
Oh my!
Can you imagine?
Gosh.
Yeah.
In the Netherlands, everybody, including the unemployed, gets a cash infusion into their bank account for the specific purpose of paying for vacation. Even the unemployed, they think, are entitled to go on vacation because unemployment is kind of stressful and they need a break from that.
Wow. So, and in this country, we have, trouble getting paid leave for pregnant women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And family leave is just laughed out the door. How did it go so wrong here? It went so well over in Europe.
Well, I believe that the key to why the situation is so bad for ordinary workers in the United States has to be rooted in the history of slavery here. I think slavery ended up creating a normative baseline for how workers should be treated that is shockingly low. And on top of that, when you look at the organized labor movement in the United States in the 19th century, workers on strike would be met with Pinkerton agents who literally shot them to death.
Yes.
You didn't see nearly that level of resistance by violent resistance by employers in Europe. So at least in Western Europe. So labor unions had a much greater chance of building and flourishing. And even today, in most countries of Europe, although the rates of membership in labor unions are quite low, the unions have enormous power to bargain on behalf of workers who are not organized. So France, for instance, has in the private sector, the union membership rate is about 6% of employees. But in fact, almost all regular employees are covered by a union contract because those unionized workers are still pretty radical. They drive a hard bargain for everybody else.
I don't want to get too much into the economics of things, But I'm wondering if there is any, have there been any studies about countries like the Netherlands and France and Denmark about whether these policies hurt their economies? I'm wondering, because the reason I ask, we have this very widespread belief that we can't ask too much because it will hurt. It will hurt our economy. And I'm wondering what the experience of these other countries have been like.
It's remarkable how they can maintain good wages for workers, even in very open economies. In Denmark and Sweden, Norway, these are very, very successful countries. You have practically everyone's middle class. It's a good life. Now, I would say that the middle class there is not consuming as much as the middle class in the United States in terms of disposable income. Like the typical house is more modest than what you would see among at least the upper half of the middle class in the United States. But, people have nice, comfortable homes. They're living well, and they don't have to save for things like college because that comes for free. If you're in Germany, for instance, not only does an 18-year-old get free tuition to college, they get a stipend. So they are financially independent of their parents. Imagine that. You get paid to go to college.
Yeah. My parents would have loved that. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah.
So, again, another thing in America that seems to differ from what happens in Europe is that a lot of European countries have socialized medicine. And of course, every time that's brought up, even on the low levels like Obamacare in this country, socialized medicine is the next step to communism, and we're all going down the tubes. But is it also, I don't think it rings true in most people's heads that if you don't have a job, you don't have health care, or you have very bad health care, sometimes not the quality of care that you would get from Blue Cross Blue Shield or any of those kind of people.
So as far as the communism things go, in Hijacked, I explain how the origins of social insurance can be traced to the Great American Revolutionary Campaign. He was the one who really thought through the logic of social insurance and proved that, at least in using English budgetary numbers, England could easily institute a social insurance program that would take care of all the elderly who were too old to work and disabled people. And on top of that, give a stakeholder grant to every young person starting out in life. Okay, so you can essentially abolish poverty if you wanted to.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Exactly. Now, the important thing, though, is that Paine was no enemy of private property at all. In fact, he believed in private property, in commerce, markets, the whole deal. And he specifically advanced his social insurance proposal in opposition to early communist ideas that were being generated during the French Revolution. People still have their liberty and personal independence, but there's no reason to, have to tolerate poverty. We could easily abolish it.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Most people, first of all, don't know anything about this, that this is our habitual way of associating things like cradle to the grave education and cradle to the grave healthcare with socialism, mostly because we've been told to.
Yeah.
Either in fact or just indirectly, since everybody else seems to think, oh, these are socialist/communist ideas. And amazingly, those two things are mixed up too. But the way that they grew up, the way those ideas grew up, that's a peculiarity of our culture, isn't it? And our history.
Absolutely. It's very bizarre. And the funny thing is that even libertarians, there's a wonderful article that came out years ago when Obamacare was being debated of a Reason magazine contributor who lived in France and experienced socialized medicine for the first time. And he came out and said, wow, this is actually a pretty good system. And nobody here seems to have a complaint about it. Once you experience it, you really want to keep it up. And that's what we saw also with in the United States with Social Security and Medicare.
Sure.
Right? I mean, that's pretty deeply entrenched. People love their Social Security and Medicare.
and I might add that Obama is not a newfangled thing. It's been around for 15 years already. It's an established program that a lot of people use.
Yep.
And it was predicted to be much smaller and to have a very bad impact on our economy. And neither thing has happened. It has grown larger, and our economy is doing fine. It's just the way that, I suppose it's just it's the way that we've been taught to associate these ideas, because you're getting education paid for by everybody's taxes, it doesn't mean that you live in a communist country.
For sure.
No, because you could say the cradle to the grave healthcare is pro-industry, because it makes sure that you are healthy and that your employer doesn't have to pay for it. It's paid for. You come to work, and basically it's in everybody's interest to be healthy, and the employer's interest for you to be healthy. I don't know. There's different ways of cutting that cake.
The first social insurance program instituted in the world was done under Otto von Bismarck, specifically on the idea that you needed a healthy workforce to industrialize successfully. And he persuaded the capitalists to get on board. And let's keep in mind that Bismarck, in addition to instituting the first social insurance program in the world, also he was notorious for his anti-socialist laws. He persecuted the members of the Social Democratic Party and other socialists. He prevented them from using the mail to distribute their pamphlets. And he even empowered local officials to exile socialist activists, many of whom, in fact, the Social Democratic Party of Germany had to meet in Switzerland because they were banned from Germany during Bismarck's rule. So he was no socialist at all, very much an anti-socialist, but he saw accurately the logic of social insurance, and capitalists were on board. When you think about it, corporations in America are burdened by the fact that they have to figure out all this health insurance stuff. It's a big cost to HR. It's a big hassle for them. It's much easier to pay wages than it is to figure out these complicated healthcare plans and to navigate that, for workers. They would like to shed those responsibilities.
Oh, very similar to the way they went to 401ks to get out from under pensions.
Yeah.
File this under why don't we learn? During the pandemic, the government came up with cash for children in poverty.
Yeah.
And childhood poverty just died on the vine. It was almost eliminated. And of course, once the pandemic was over, everything went back to normal, and now kids are back in problems. Whenever we have a situation where family leave or maternity leave is given and administered in a healthy way, the workers come back to work, are productive. The business doesn't lose anything. Whenever a business pays a living wage, as opposed to a poverty wage or opposed to a really low minimum wage, workers respond with more work, and it doesn't bankrupt the company. So why do we keep reliving these lies over and over again when every time we put it to the test, it turns out that the lies aren't correct and that workers can live a decent life and things can go well for business as well?
Well, this all goes back to the origins of what I call the secularized work ethic during the Industrial Revolution. So over time, it lost its theological sheen with the Puritan Calvinist theology and moved over into a secular realm. And a key thinker about welfare policy was Thomas Malthus. Americans, by and large, live in Malthus's idea world. Malthus thought that if you give poor people free stuff, they're just going to want to lay on a hammock and not take any initiatives with their lives, not work hard, won't save, and have more kids than they can afford to support. And the undeserving poor would receive welfare at the expense of working people. So working people are entitled to resent people who get benefits for free. And those are the dependent people. They should be stigmatized and despised. Right? This sounds pretty familiar, but it all coming straight out of Malthus. And that's the world in which so many Americans live.
Yes, definitely, because that's sort of the deal. It's easy for people who are opposed to welfare to say, well, it's your tax money that's keeping them afloat. And also, yeah, the whole idea it's lazy when, as a reporter, I've seen firsthand when I'm assigned to go out and do stories on welfare, that most welfare moms are desperate to get a job with
absolutely.
regular hours and regular pay. They don't want to be on welfare. They don't want to be trapped in that situation.
Absolutely. That's true. And that was found, during the Clinton welfare reform, that most Americans would actually rather be working than get welfare if they're of working age. And people are desperate for work. And it's also part of the work ethic, right? I mean, people do ground, especially in America, ground a lot of their sense of identity and pride in work. And it's no less true for the poor than it is for the middle class. They feel the same way. One of the things we know from basic income experiments, so this is very important refutation, actually, of Malthus. There have been hundreds of experiments done around the world, and quite a large number of them in the United States, too. They're fairly small scale. The question is, what happens if you just give very poor people a basic monthly income? It won't be enough to cover everything, but maybe it's something like, $500 a month. Okay, now that's an enormous sum of money for poor people. It's actually life transforming. And, empirically, what happens? Do they lie on a hammock? No. On the contrary, what happens is if you're absolutely desperate and on the edge of subsistence and maybe like looking at an expense like your car is broken down or something, and then you're desperate, right? And you don't have money to pay for a repair. Now you're in terrible shape. What it does is it narrows poverty, limits your time horizon to just taking care of business for the next day, for the next week. So you can't plan any initiatives that extend very far ahead of time. You can't really plan your life. If you give people $500 a month, now they can raise their sights. They have a little headroom there to think about other things. Maybe they have enough money to take some courses in community college and train up to get a better job. Very, very consistently, and we find this worldwide, even a relatively modest sum of money actually empowers people to take initiatives with their lives, to get a better education, to skill up so they can get better jobs. In poor countries, even a little bit of money can be enough to start your own micro business, to take care of your kids better. In fact, kids do much better if their parents are not totally stressed out, wondering whether there's going to be a roof over their heads the next day. And they have a little bit more emotional stability to be able to pay attention to their kids and help them with their homework. Right? I mean, so kids also do much better. They're better behaved at school and at home, less likely to get entangled with the law. As teenagers, they have better employment prospects, when they are old enough to take a job. They graduate from high school more. They have better grades. Like on every measure you can imagine, they do better just by giving the parents a little bit of free stuff. So Malthus was 100% wrong.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm glad we arrived at that conclusion.
See, it's very hard to persuade people otherwise because it's so deeply ingrained in ideology.
Well, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the machinery of ingrainment here, and which brings me back to the second half of Don's wonderful question that started us off, which is, how do we get out of this?
Well, that's a really great question.
Come up with them every once in a while. I don't always have the answers, but I come up with good questions.
I'm not a revolutionary. All progress is incremental. Okay. And what we're finding is, Obamacare basically got passed by the skin of its teeth by a hair, right? One vote. And, it's all this outrage, but now people are used to it. And now they like it. The same thing, about other programs. If you only give people a taste of what successful policy looks like, they will support it. So I'm a big believer in learning from experience, but you have to give people the chance to have that experience, right? And that's one of the reasons why the opponents don't even want to undertake the experiment, right? Because they know how much better life could be.
They're afraid they won't work.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We'll return to the musical Innertube in mere moments. But first, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Elizabeth Anderson is the John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies, the Max Shea Professor of Public Philosophy, and the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan. She teaches courses in ethics, social and political philosophy, political economy, philosophy of the social sciences, and feminist theory.
Among her books are Value in Ethics and Economics, The Imperative of Integration, and Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. She has written numerous articles on value theory, the ethical limitations of markets, racial integration and affirmative action, democratic theory, and the history of ethics.
For more about Elizabeth, check out her University of Michigan webpage at lsa.umich.edu/philosophy/people/faculty/eandersn.html.
And now, back to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
We have an election coming up this year, and President Biden finds himself in an interesting situation because there are progressives in the Democratic Party that would like to do a lot of the things that we're talking about. And he has talked about backing some of those programs. Certainly he did during the pandemic. He did come up with extra cash for families and that sort of thing. However, he also wants to get reelected.
Yeah.
So he kind of backs off on that a little bit and every once in a while talks like a good capitalist, and winds up pissing off the progressives in his party. So how do we get that initiated? How do we get that fine line where we get a chance to show people, hey, if we do have medicine paid for by the government, it's not all bad. I have Medicare and it's working pretty well. And I have Social Security and it's helping me get by. So how do we then get younger people or other people to take that chance and put that into practice, even on a temporary scale, to see how it would work?
Yeah. So I have to say that the younger generation truly does not believe that Social Security and Medicare are going to be around for them.
Yes.
And consequently, they think, well, this is just benefits for old people and they already have all the money anyways, right? They have all the wealth in society. Right. And that's what's making, I think, quite a lot of them cynical. And they're less fully aware of the fact that, look, this is why we have democracy, right? It's up to the voters to keep and expand these policies and to deal younger generations into them. It's nothing inevitable. There's no inevitable bankruptcy of social insurance. That's a bunch of nonsense. It actually wouldn't take that much to fully fund Social Security and Medicare. I would recommend the simple expedient of lifting the cap on Social Security wages. Okay.
Yeah.
So that, and also to count the capital income that executives get in virtue of being, executives at their corporations. If they're paid in shares, that should be counted as income, not as capital, which isn't taxed under the Social Security taxes. No, counted, right? That should be taxed too. You get a lot of revenue that way. A few other expedients.
And I think for the most part, they will not feel the pain of that. They might feel it a little bit.
Think about it. Elon Musk is $200 billion. He can't possibly spend it all on himself. And none of the other billionaires can. It's just too much. I mean, think about it. Like, how many houses can you usefully use? 365 houses. And we spend one day a year in each of the 365 houses, right? It doesn't make sense. How much more can you eat? Your stomach is a limited capacity.
Yeah.
You can't spend it all on yourself, and they wouldn't even notice the difference, frankly.
And something else that you bring up in the book it is the hypocrisy, I want to say, of somebody who is a CEO and is making a bulk of their income off of capital gains, which is money they put aside and don't do anything with and is handed to them. The interest is handed to them.
Elon Musk at SpaceX, that's all government. I mean, that was started by the government, basically. The government's funding a lot of his rockets.
Yes. So again, for those people to be against handouts to the poor when they're living off of handouts is kind of hypocritical when you come right down to it.
Yeah.
To go back to this notion of incremental steps and the notion that we probably should the only way to do this is to try some programs along this line. I think there was momentarily a lot of support for paid maternal leave. There was about 20 years ago, 15 years ago. For a while, it looked like that was going to get passed, but it got elbowed out of the way by Obamacare. And also, I think Obama as a president was leery of being thought too liberal, although maybe his heart was to the left of where his head was. I believe that true. I think for about 2 years there, a lot of people were saying, why don't we have paid maternal leave or just paid parental leave? We don't have to make it gender specific or even spouse specific. It's the person who stays home with the kids, and that's good for families. It would be good for families. It'd probably be wonderful for women who get still the bulk of childcare, especially early. And it just seems like it makes sense. It would make healthier, happier families. Yeah. And for 2 years, it was okay to talk about it. And now you never hear it.
It's not on the
spoken. Its name is not, it's just never. And it seems as though it would be not a huge program. It'd be a middling size program. It would not be enormous in terms of the amount of money that we're talking about. But it's funny that it has disappeared. So maybe that's that incremental step we've been talking about, is bring that back. It's got a certain amount of attractiveness for both sides. I think Republican women would love to have paid 6 weeks of paid parental leave, as well as I think Republican guys would like it too. I could be a daddy for 6 weeks, bond with my kid at home.
Beautiful thing, wouldn't it? Yeah. So in France, when you have a newborn, not only do you get parental leave, but they also have a provision where you can bring in some help. Who isn't going to help with the baby? They do the laundry, the cooking, so that you can spend all your time playing with your newborn. What benefits, ordinary people enjoy in other countries. Although if I was going to...
but that's smart.
Yeah, it is. It's very smart. But if I was going to actually think about a program that I would want. It's two programs having to do with families that I think would make a huge difference. One would be restoration of the refundable child tax credit that we had in under the Biden's pandemic stimulus. Makes a huge difference not to grow up in poverty. That's just an enormous impact on child welfare.
Yes.
But the other thing would be universal preschool.
Yeah.
Which also is like a huge investment. People don't understand for every dollar invested in preschool education, society gets $7 back. It's one of the best investments ever. People, if the kids grow up, they're better. They get a head start on socialization, on education, on learning school routines and psychosocial education. And they're really ready to learn once they hit kindergarten and first grade. It really boosts really everything about child welfare. I do think that when Biden got elected and the Democrats briefly controlled Congress, that there was over-optimism and progressives they came up with a Christmas tree bill, right, with a million different things they would love to implement, but only fund it for a couple of years. I think that was a bad strategy. I think they should have really focused on designing one or two really strongly supported policies and fund it permanently.
Yeah.
And then you prove it incrementally. People will learn how great these things are.
In some of the outer realms of punditry, it was suggested when we came out of the throes of COVID, it was suggested that the government act to make some of these programs permanent. The child credit, for example, which I think just about everybody knows there's good evidence that it was really important for a lot of people and that people felt it when it stopped.
Yeah.
But the people who felt when it stopped, A, don't vote so much, B, don't earn so much, C, don't have much of a voice.
Yeah.
But there was just for a tick there. We're talking about these just little glimmers, just for a tick there. You might have seen that. There's a tax credit that most lower earning workers don't even know about, that most of them don't even take, which exists on the books still. And it would take such an effort of one of the things that would cost the most is making sure people knew what this was, right? And and what it was, and is it available to you, and how you get it, because most people don't realize that this even happened. Most of that we're talking about, this child credit that happened during it was a dead socialist program. Absolutely. It was important because a lot of people were losing work. A lot of people couldn't go to their jobs. And it was an attempt to shore up lower earners who, have 3 jobs, work at McDonald's and then Burger King and then sweeping a floor someplace, because there's plenty of people like that, millions of them. And they needed some help and they got it. And then once we came out of the disease era, the government was a little bit worried about asking too much and so did not try to make it permanent, and again, it's about how ideology gets, basically taken in through the pores in the United States.
Yeah, that's right. And the stigma attached to so-called welfare dependence. I'm very Malthusian idea that there's something wrong with getting free stuff from the government, even though the rich get lots of free stuff.
Oh, my goodness. Yes.
Oh, that's true. Well, the rich are, and the rich and famous, if I want to, get into ET and TMZ and all that kind of stuff, is, they're going to get the good seats in the restaurant. They're going to get the perfect cars. And they will be given these cars and these restaurant seats by the operators of those facilities, because it's just so wonderful to have somebody who has money and recognition sitting in our business, that somehow that's going to rub off and our business is going to be better because of that. And
right.
That doesn't happen, does it?
That's right. But I'm even thinking about free stuff from the government. So here's the thing, is that free stuff for rich people usually takes the form of things like tax deductions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. And so they think, well, it's not free stuff. But the truth is that from an economic point of view, a tax deduction and a fiscal expenditure are equivalent.
Yes.
Right. Any economist will tell you that. And so if you look at, say, subsidies to the well-off, like I get employer-covered health insurance. I don't pay taxes on that, even though it's clearly a form of income. Okay. Or, I've paid off my house now because I've lived in the same house for a long time. But, for a long time, I got a tax deduction on the interest I paid on my mortgage. That is a direct federal subsidy for middle-class people's housing, which, by the way, if you add it all up, vastly exceeds spending on public housing for the poor.
Yes. Yes,
right?
indeed.
It's a subsidy of middle-class lifestyles. But, it feels like, well, I'm just, a virtuous person. So I'm entitled to a lower tax rate.
Exactly.
That's what they think.
I was just going to say, when does it move from a benefit to an entitlement?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Right.
again, a lot of these programs to help the poor are labeled by people who oppose them as entitlement programs. Which is not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Well, it's entitlements in a stigmatized way when the poor get them.
Yes.
Right.
But entitlements in an honored way when they enjoy them.
Well, and what I think is interesting is that we have things, as I was mentioning just a minute ago, like the earned income tax credit, which most people, even the people who get it, they don't actually know that exists. But if you go, I swear to God, if you go on the government's webpage that explains it, they say this is to give lower earning people a tax break. That's what they say. That's what it is. So if I'm making $24,000 a year, plenty of people like that. And I'm more likely to be a person of color, more likely to be very, very poor, more likely to be a single mother at home with kids. All those people, as you said, even if it was something like $500 a month, would really benefit. An extra $6,000 lying around for folks like that. That is a quarter of their income. It's a person who makes 24,000.
Exactly.
I'm just saying.
Exactly.
So
what made it actually politically possible, the earned income tax credit, was the fact that it was attached to work.
Yes.
And what that means is the tax credit is actually proportional to earnings up to a cap, which means, ironically and sadly, that the people who are just barely, like, they can only find gig work or just a few hours a week, they're mostly cut out of these benefits at the expense of their kids.
Right.
Because again, the assumption is that if you can't find regular work, there must be something wrong with you. There must be, you must be vicious in some way.
And again, there's a whole prejudice. I was president in the Pennsylvania Senate when the debate was going on about raising the minimum wage, which hasn't happened. I've been out of the Pennsylvania Senate now for 4 years. The debate was going on for most of the time I was there, and it's still $7 an hour. And it still is $7 an hour nationally.
Now, here's the thing, that, in fact, within the discipline of economics, there's been an explosion of really excellent empirical work. And the best studies out there, now they're superb studies of raising the minimum wage, because the fear has always been if you raise the minimum wage, then the quantity of labor demanded by employers will decline, and so you'll get unemployment. Well, very clever economic studies have been done. What you do is you take the counties that are on either side of a state line, where one state raises the minimum wage and the other state lowers it. And you look at the lowest paid workers, which are typically fast food workers.
Yeah.
And you look at whether employment drops right at the borderline, because people could always go to the McDonald's across the state line. Right. And so the question is, was there an employment decline in the state in that narrow band of fast food employers on the side of the state border, which raised the minimum wage compared to the neighboring state, which didn't, and has a lower minimum wage? And the answer is no.
Really?
Surprisingly not.
Yeah.
Wow. I wouldn't have thunk it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember in those arguments about the minimum wage, there were senators who stood up and said, and this is their understanding. This is the other thing. When you get into a raised situation where you're middle class, upper middle class, or higher, you don't know what's going on the ground floor. You're living on the second floor and you don't know what's happening on the street. And there were a lot of senators who said, so we raise the minimum wage. What are we going to have? A bunch of millionaire 18-year-olds? Not thinking that there are plenty of people working minimum wage jobs now who are way older than 18 and have way more responsibilities than teenagers. So the whole idea was that they didn't have a handle on who those employees were.
And again, you can look at the experience of other countries. So Australia has a very high minimum wage. You can be a barista at Starbucks in Australia and be able to afford to raise a family.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Okay. And I have to say, if you've ever been to Australia, they have great pride in their cafe culture because they brew their coffee superbly. Yeah. They're very fussy about their coffee. And they have really, really great coffee and an excellent cafe culture. And even with these very high minimum wages, you have plenty of cafes to choose from.
Yeah.
With excellent, excellent coffee and happy workers. Imagine that. We can have it all.
Amazing.
We probably should have Elizabeth back because although I think we've covered the waterfront, there's still a lot that we could talk about the way that ideas get hijacked, which I think is really interesting. Yeah. And my favorite one is the term empowerment. When it first came out, it was to give power to somebody to do something. And now it's to make something someone's responsibility, which is a big change in,
yes.
in what, when you are empowered to do something, you are empowered to do it or else. And if you don't do it, you will show that I should disempower you. And it just, there are little, that's a little mise en scène right there about how terms, ways of thinking are hijacked. And I'd love to talk about a little bit more. But anyway, this has been wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you for being on the Musical Innertube. And
yeah, it's been a blast. Wonderful talking with you.
Yes, it has been. And we have just scratched the surface. So maybe we'll come back later because, of course, Elizabeth, you not only talk about equality at work, but you talk about equality in life. And there's a lot more going on in life than that we could talk about. So thanks for being with us. We'll have to have you back.
I love that. Yeah.
Terrific. We'll have you back. Elizabeth Anderson from the University of Michigan. Thanks for being with us.
Take care. Bye.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Hey, let us know how we're doing. Send us an email at musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Do you know someone with a great story to tell? Let us know. Send us an email or log in to our website, musicalinnertube.com, and click on the microphone in the lower right-hand corner to leave us a voicemail.
And while you're on our website, take a few minutes to listen to past episodes of the podcast. They're all there, along with pictures and biographies of our guests, blog posts, and lots more.
And as always, our thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.